Thank you for joining us today at the second Australian Circular Economy Conference hosted by the University of Sydney. This session will focus in particular on construction, and we will discuss together how circular economy models and strategies can contribute to make the building construction sector more efficient and sustainable in future. My name is Eugenia Gasparri, and I'm a lecturer in architectural technologies within the School of Architecture, Design and Planning, and today I will be moderating this session for you. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodian of the land we are currently on, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and culture. So before leaving the stage to Donald McNeill, who's Professor of Urbanism within the school, I would like to introduce our three fantastic panelists and thank them for being here today with us to offer their perspective and expert opinions on the topic of circular economy in construction. At the end of the talk, we hope to answer to some of your questions as well, so feel free to type any comment or question you might have in the chat box. And I will get to them at the end of our panel. So here we are, Arianna. Arianna is a lecturer in architecture within the school. She holds a PhD with honors in building engineering from Politecnico di Milano, and she has a master's degree in both engineering and architecture. Her research relates to human-centered design and building performance assessment with a focus on construction and innovative technologies for sustainable and healthy built environments. Clare is an architect with an extensive international experience in sustainable design and construction. She has spent the last 4 years as a sustainability manager for Built, delivering market-leading sustainable projects around Australia. She was recognized as well by the International Well Building Institute with the prestigious Leadership Recognition Award, which acknowledges her influential role in advancing health and wellness in buildings. And then Adam is a civil engineer currently working with Wood Solution Australia. He's been named the GBCA Future Green Leader of the Year for 2019 and a finalist for the Property Council Future Leader 2020. He's also the creator and host of the brilliant Timber Talks podcast, and he's very passionate about the structural engineer's role to play in reducing embodied energy emissions of buildings. So Arianna, Clare, and Adam, welcome, and thank you for being here with us today. Now, as promised, I'll leave the stage to Donald for a brief overview on today's topic of discussion, construction and the circular economy, drivers, barriers, and opportunities.
Thanks very much, Eugenia, and thanks very much for joining, everyone. My job is really just to give a very brief overview of some of the kind of key issues which might frame the discussion. And obviously in the conference, many of these things have probably already been broached and will continue to be so in other fields. Notably, the field of waste is a huge issue, of course, in construction. We've decided not to spend too much time on that in this panel, although of course it will probably come up as a very important issue. We are focusing a little bit more on some of the business models and materials and methods which might be adopted in the Australian kind of context. So what are the kind of business models that might be available going forward? We're really kind of focused on Australia, conscious perhaps that Australia might be a bit behind other parts of the world in adopting circular economy principles, but again, the panel might have different views on that. But I think, the MacArthur Foundation, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has already, done quite a lot of work on this, and they've identified 3 different areas where, there are opportunities to get a competitive edge in the construction field. That begins with use and reuse, particularly the whole field of retrofitting and repairs and upgrades. Recovery, and instead of obviously tipping and illegally dumping things at the end of the life of existing buildings, how well can we recycle housing materials? And then design, particularly for, I guess, new build, but also, of course, in the retrofitting space, how to bring in energy efficient, low carbon housing materials and how to account for that in the construction process. Next slide, please, Eugenia. So, I mean, one of the focuses here is, of course, materials, and we've got practitioners who are really at the forefront of getting buildings up, if you like. So one of the things which will be interesting to discuss is the emergence of cross-laminated timber and other materials such as recycled plastic bricks, and how these potentially new materials, which have strong claims to sustainability, might be adopted. The second thing which might be interesting to consider is the role of concrete and the degree to which we can work better with concrete. We can produce less carbon intensive concrete because concrete is obviously a key central element in the construction process. And then thinking not just about the structure of buildings, but thinking about insulation. These are, of course, really important for ways in which domestic energy consumption might be reduced. And there are some interesting new things coming through in terms of how we can upcycle or reuse materials for insulation products. And then the final area which might be interesting to consider is new manufacturing techniques. And this really brings us into the whole innovation economy field. There's a lot of discussion about advanced manufacturing in Australia at the moment, and whether it is doing enough, whether the government is doing enough to promote it. That, of course, runs all the way from pharmaceuticals through to things like modular housing construction and prefabrication. And of course, one of the things that is really important here is that we can design for disassembly, so that as few things as possible are glued or cemented or otherwise fixed together and have to be smashed up when they are demolished. What is the role for example, 3D printed building parts, particularly in repairing buildings as well? And then what are the kind of new design and management support tools that can actually make performance monitoring, program maintenance, the insertion and swapping of materials perhaps further on the life cycle of a building when new innovations have been made? What are these kind of platforms and how can these be adopted? So keeping this very brief, of course, is obviously be really great to hear the panel and their views on some of these topics and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. This certainly gives us a solid base to build upon for our panel discussion. So I guess I stop my to share my screen now, and yeah, we can start with just okay. Perfect. So first of all, I would like to start from drivers for change. So I guess one of the main drivers, probably the main driver currently, is the climate crisis we are facing at the moment, that is forcing many industries to reconsider the way they work and function, and the construction industry is no exception to that. In fact, buildings and the building construction sector, as we probably all know, they are responsible for a considerable amount of the overall global energy consumption and CO2 emissions as well. This means that the way we design, assemble, operate, use, and ultimately dismantle buildings will have to undergo a profound change very soon towards what it is a more sustainable models and efficient approaches to construction. And this includes things like drastic waste reduction, use of renewable resources and materials, technological advancements to maximize building performance and energy efficiency, and so on. So, Claire, I would like to start with you. Like, in your experience as part of one of the Australia's largest construction groups built, if we look at the current state, what do you think, like what materials and technologies that are available today may be leading the shift of the construction sector from a purely linear economy to a circular one?
Hi, thank you. Firstly, I tend to agree with those principles that were first shown about use and recovery and design, and that those are the themes of what I was thinking about when been sort of coming up with some ideas to speak on the panel and how that's been translating in the work that Built have been doing. So in terms of use, and particularly reuse, that has been where the greatest opportunity is for us in terms of materials that are available today. It's what's already there, what's already been taken out of the earth and built into something. And the more that we start to consider how we can keep that value in our economy instead of kind of coming to an old building and treating it like rubbish instead of like, you know, treasure, that the more that we can really participate in a more circular economy. So Built has a development arm, and in some of our own developments, we are working with heritage projects, and because of heritage constraints as well, we've had to really work hard to save as much of an existing building as possible. And at the same time, we've been using technology and tools like life cycle assessment to get a very, very strong understanding of the embodied carbon associated with with the work that we're doing. And so on a project here in Sydney called Substation, it was an old substation, hence the name, and we put all the value of those materials into a life cycle tool, and we're able to communicate very quickly and clearly to the whole team, you know, just by keeping this building, we've got around a 30% reduction in embodied carbon from a reference case, like building a brand new building here. And I think this use of, in terms of the technology side of things that we're talking about, this use of life cycle assessment as an everyday tool in the same way you budget on a job, and it's not scary, it's just something, you know, it's Excel spreadsheets or there's online ones, and they've become extremely effective for us in being able to show our broader project teams what we can do, where we can save. And in some jobs we're working on now, that research is being done at the same time as we're doing initial cost planning, because it goes hand in hand. You know, the things you're spending a lot of money on are and where you can save money on it, also quite often where you're spending a lot of carbon and where you can save carbon. The other thing that the life cycle assessment is really opening up, so what I've spoken about is kind of the embodied carbon considerations at the beginning of a job when you're first getting materials and how you can reduce that. But then when you look at the whole of life picture and you start to think about materials, you know, timber, concrete, steel, and then by putting it into a life cycle assessment, that forces you to also have these considerations like what is going to happen at the end of this project. And instead of that being someone else's problem, you might start to actually define what the expectations are, and maybe the way you design is then going to reflect that. So whether you're, you know, clearly designing for disassembly where that's possible, or accepting that maybe you're putting a post-tensioned concrete slab that's pretty impossible to disassemble, so that you suffer the carbon impost from doing that. The other thing that we did on a project recently, Barrack Place with Investor in Sydney, was they had a 6D BIM strategy for the job, and that meant they were carrying the sort of levels of design that they were using the BIM system for was going right through, and their expectation was that the design is done there. We have sort of a digital twin of the building, and it's going to be an operational tool. So every little component in that building has a QR code, which enables, if you're thinking about that end of life and disassembly and renewal, you have a really, really good, clear understanding of exactly what's in that building. And that information is so helpful when you do want to disassemble and assess the value of something. If you don't know what it is, then it becomes a really big mess, and it's a whole lot of time for people to, and I think perhaps why sometimes, you know, like going to landfill and just getting rid of it is the answer, instead of being able to say, well, we've got 68 ducts here, and we know that those could be recycled, or maybe someone can use them. So that level of information in our buildings, and I know coming into old buildings, you'd like, that would be amazing to have some of that information now. So that's a great technology that I've seen used now on sites. The design for disassembly and the prefabrication space is also something that I think we're going to be, we see as a very exciting opportunity. Obviously, there's a lot of ability to reduce waste and build quickly. So two things which have negative impacts on our whole of life carbon assessment. So those are probably the key things that I've seen being used on jobs now that are helping us understand the real carbon impact on projects. Sorry, Eugenia, are you going to go into the next part of this question now, or do you want to go to the other panelists? And
I see. Yeah, we can. Yeah. So basically, what my other question would be like, if you look in perspective, what do you think will be like the major research trends and trajectory in the field in the years to come, in the field of technologies? And
particularly around construction, I think getting very good data would be great if we're able to obtain more information, especially sort of making the numbers around what the embodied carbon for a project should be, what the whole of life carbon should be, that information becoming more transparent. And I think with tools like Neighbours, you kind of have a really good idea of the energy consumption of a building, but we don't have that same knowledge around carbon. And so that's becoming more apparent and more widely known and able, you can kind of make a judgment call if a project says, oh, we've got, 400 kilograms of carbon per meter squared in LA, and another job 800. Like, I think some of that information is kind of meaningless right now. We don't have like a scale to understand it on. So good research and communication around that would be something I would really like to see coming out. And then with materials, there's very, very exciting things that we've started to see. We had a tour at the Smart Centre at UNSW a couple of years back, and what they were doing there was like, that was one of the best work days I'd ever had. I was so excited about just the possibilities that could come out of getting all these materials and really being able to recycle, kind of almost make them into something better than they might have been before. And that's always been one of the issues with recycling, is that you kind of downgrading and you're losing value in your material economy. So I'd love to see some of that become commercially available, and that when we are procuring materials, that we've got a lot more options to go for recycled options, or instead of it always being new and this new thing being that's what you want, and it's kind of second best to get something recycled. And better understanding of that being just, there's really high value. It's like jewelry. It's not, some building materials are essentially the same, like steel. It's not degrading in a lot when it gets reused. It's still a great material, so reuse is really important. Probably steel's a bad example because that is well reused and well known, but maybe some of the other ones where we are not quite valuing their potential as a reused material.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. I'm glad you talked a lot about design for manufacturing and assembly and disassembly, which I believe it's a very, very important topic, as well as the importance of information transfer and transparency in construction, and knowledge acquisition, like knowledge transfer and management in projects, from project to project and within one project as well, because I think it's definitely they play a fundamental role in this transition, like to maximize circularity in construction. Arianna, perhaps would you like to share with us your view and perspective as an academic and researcher within the field? Perhaps focusing as well in looking in perspective to what you think will be the research trends in material and technologies and trajectories in future.
I think that Claire touched upon some of the trends and keywords that we also see like coming sort of or more common and common in the research field, especially, and I really feel that this issue about clarity, especially from my point of view, that's more about LCA calculation and expertise in how to do that process. It's really about clarity about how to assess the embodied impacts of a materials of a building or whatever it's whatever it's studied at the moment, and how to benchmark against different cases. Because when you say, okay, this building has 10 tons of CO2 equivalents, and so what does it mean? Is it good? Is it bad? So if it's just a number, it doesn't really mean nothing, especially for the clients. I'm thinking that for in this moment, sustainability, circular economy, LCA is just another cost for clients. So it's something that I don't want to say that they don't see, or it's difficult to see the value. I'm just saying that when you weigh pros and cons, sustainability comes with a price, right? So with an extra cost. So it must be necessary to show the wider benefits, benchmarking against different cases, and maybe also not just on a national kind of framework and perspective, but on the international framework as well. And if we go back to the idea of clarity, is not just the final results, but is also about the process, because at this stage there are different LCI, so life cycle inventory, that are available in the market. So whatever kind of calculation, or with the one that you are using to do your calculation, then you have the different results. So considering that there's no standard approach, it's easy, let's say, to cheat somehow, or maybe it could also be not a voluntary, let's say, kind of trick. But, you know, when you refer to different inventories, then the results that you have at the end is different. So there's no real ground for a fair comparison. And as well, not just about the inventory that you use, but it's also about the phases that you use, because life cycle assessment consider the impacts from the manufacturing process to the end of life. But at the current stage, most of the calculations don't account for end of life. So they just stop at the operational phase. So clearly there is a big, like a huge part there that is not studied. So it's not considered. And that's where I would like to see some of the research efforts to provide data and provide more knowledge about what's happening. Because as Claire was saying, part of the circularity in the circular economy is really like these cycles of materials. So we have materials that we can reuse somehow, but usually, for example, let's take glass as the first example. So glass ideally can be recycled forever. It's a very good material, but with all the surface treatment, the coatings and everything that we are doing to glass now for our skyscraper in the Sydney CBD, then that material can be used just to be crushed and melted again into bottles, for example. So where is the value of a material that can be used just for a downgrade of purpose? So it's always about balancing like what you have and what you can have at the end. And this is probably in line with the idea of looking at what I would really like to see is like a construction sector that looks at material, looks at buildings no more like enclosed space. So in that kind of view, the building fabrics, the skin is not just a separator between the indoor and the outdoor, but it's more like a storage of materials. So it's really like we have this availability that is now used for this purpose, but can be reused in the future. So maybe you have, and here I'm just blue sky thinking like what can be the future, but I'm thinking about having a map of different materials available like on the whole city, for example. So, you know, okay, I'm building these beautiful buildings in 3 years, and I know that in 2 years these other building will have this amount of materials that can be reused because they are going to different kind of processes and they are towards the end of the life. So I can reuse that in this way. So let's say cross-contaminating different projects, different sectors, different kind of industries as well to create this circularity. Because as long as we look, and especially in the construction sector, we know that it's really fragmented. So as long as we look just in our bubble, let's say, it's very difficult to enable this circularity. So I would say that the future of research is really in creating the connection and creating the data for enabling this connection.
Thank you, Arianna. Very interesting insight. And Adam, we know we have a passion in common, timber and mass timber. So my question for you, it's again in talking about materials and technologies, but I feel we didn't give enough space to the fantastic technology that is timber. So working in wood solutions, I know you follow very closely policy and regulation developments as well in your team. So with respect to use of mass timber technologies in construction and for the Australian market, could you perhaps tell us more about the different opportunities, but also perhaps the barriers that are related to the diffusion of new sustainable materials and technologies on the Australian market?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me today. This is a fantastic conference, and I love hearing from Clare and Arianna so far. So when we're talking about mass timber construction, it is a little bit similar to stick frame. We are familiar with the timber product, how it grows out of the ground with photosynthesis, locking in carbon dioxide. And then, you know, if you've got the tree that takes, say, 30 years in a plantation to grow, then you lock it within a building, and say if the building life cycle is above 30 more years, which it almost certainly is, then you've got carbon dioxide sequestered on both ends. So obviously, if you get the land use right and you replant it and everything like that, it is an incredible story there. But it's also not the only products going forward. You know, you got green steel, you got geopolymer concrete. So it is a really exciting space, particularly for structural engineers. But there's been a lot of talk about the end of life and design for disassembly, and this is something that everyone knows, and I think sustainability consultants are well aware of it, but it is a multidisciplinary issue about trying to get all engineers excited about this problem as well. And Donald said at the start as well how it can be simple detailing, like in the case of a timber building, rather than having, you know, glue lamb connected with a CLT on top with glue and screws, you just use a screw connection instead of glue. So at the end of life, it's very easy to disassemble. But all the circular economy principles, we need to adopt them, but the biggest barrier, like everything, is the hard truth that it does come down to cost, which Arianna briefly mentioned. And we need the cost curves to be driven down so these are adopted, because at the end of the day, you've got 5 builders tendering for a job. They're competing with each other. The ones who are doing the moral right thing and, you know, doing the LCA, making decisions with the best interest of the planet at heart, you know, they're not going to win the job. So we need it actually to be driven down significantly. And for me, this is where technology comes into play, and new paradigms of design is the thing that's going to drive the cost down significantly. So prefabrication is the obvious one, and timber is an enabler of prefabrication. It's very lightweight to work with, and you know, can go in a factory and really be assembled like an IKEA flat pack furniture. What we're doing is really piggybacking off automotive industry concepts. So you mentioned the Timber Talks podcast. I had Michael Marks on it. He started Katera and was the ex-CEO of Tesla, and really interesting guy. But what they're trying to do is borrow the automotive principle of designing once and applying that one design for all buildings. So it's a kit of parts approach compared to the traditional one, which is essentially you're doing every single building as a prototype. You're starting from the ground up. You're designing every single beam and column, and that's just adding particularly unnecessary costs in a lot of projects. So, you know, that's one area. There's also robotics, which is also an exponential technology, which is increasing at a very fast rate, and put that in a factory. Once you spend the capital up front, which is really expensive, all that you need is software updates after that to get any improvements in productivity there. And there's a whole bunch of other technologies around that, but that's the thing that we need. We need the cost curves to go down. And if you think about mass timber, specifically of the adoption curve, you've got the innovators, early adopters, early majority. Really, right now, we're still at the very start. And once everything starts getting adopted more, the experience that engineers and architects and builders have got will increase again. And with the extra knowledge, we'll design smarter and build smarter. And again, the cost will come down. So I'm kind of optimistic where it's all going. But the key is finding how to improve value and reduce cost.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, totally agree. I'm optimistic as well. So thank you very much. Adam, and thank you all. And this brings us to the second topic of this session. So we have just discussed opportunities regarding materials and technology development in construction, present stage and future perspective as well. So I would like now to talk about the enablers for the change. So I guess transitioning from an economical model to another, in the specific case, linear to a circular, it's something that does not happen overnight, particularly in a rather complex and manifold system such that of architecture and building construction, where a multitude of different and highly diverse actors coexist. Arianna, first question is for you. Who do you think will be those actors or figures or bodies, entities across the building construction value chain that will have a highly critical role in driving the change? And also, perhaps I can ask you that as well, looking at your specific role in education as a researcher and educator, how would you say you could be part of that change?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, because I think that honestly, exactly because, as you said, there's a chain in the construction market, right? It starts from the concept design, or even earlier, it starts with the client brief, and then it goes on, and it's about design, construction, and maintenance as well, and then maybe at the end of the life of the building, whoever is taking part of that phase as well. I don't think that we can really find one actor that could enable the process, because it's about being a chain. It's about all the different parts of the chain as well. So if one is not engaged into the circular economy or into the, let's say, more broader discussion of sustainability, then all the chain is not really working, because the building or the sustainability of the building is really about all these phases. So you can have the best, let's say, the best idea about the building as client, but if you don't find the architect and the builder that can support you in building what you would like to do, then it's difficult to realize this type of building, and as well for all the other parts. So as architects, we can design beautiful buildings, and as beautiful, I mean very sustainable, not like aesthetically, I hope also aesthetically beautiful, but very sustainable buildings. But then when the building or the project is in the end of the engineers and the constructor, are they going to prefer, let's say, sustainability over the cost, for example? So it's all about, all about these different person that really needs to be engaged in the same way towards the same or towards a common goal. We can't really find one that will drive all the change. Or maybe if we can find someone that can drive the change, is probably someone that is above the construction sector, so government, for example, saying from tomorrow, all the buildings should be built according to this set of criteria or rules, and then it's one alone. Otherwise, I don't think it's really feasible to just find one actor. And the second part of the question about what I think it could be my role as educator, that's a very good one. And I hope that I give to my students the same passion and the same kind of attitude towards sustainability that I have. So if they can go out of the university, or they can have their degree with the same awareness about the topic and the importance of sustainability in the future, they could, I would hope, let's say, that they could be they could advocate for a different future. So that's what I think is our role as educator, is really like, putting out there the questions that we see and try to enable students to have a critical approach to all these kind of issues and to be able to do their own. So it's not really, let's say, I don't want to say an active role, but is enabling students who are the future architects to be the change or to drive the change. So I hope that that's what we are doing. At the university, you should ask about my students probably. That's my hope.
Thank you, Arianna. As an academic and researcher myself, I very much share your view in the role we have both to inspire students and also push sustainable development agenda throughout our research as much as we can. And I believe it's also very important for academia, and it's something I'd like to add, to work in close contact with the industry, to know what's happening outside there. So work together and support the industry as well in their endeavor to come up with new solutions and frameworks to make the change possible. So Adam, would you like to give your perspective on the topic, and as well as, again, thinking about your role, how would you and your team and Wood Solution perhaps in your daily routine and work you do, like, would be able to help driving this change? Yeah, so the question around who across the value chain the most critical or who can add the most value. The question for me, it wouldn't be around necessarily a single discipline as well, but it's probably a way of thinking, because I think cross-disciplinary approach is the way to solve a lot of the new problems, and new types of thinking and paradigms altogether from different industries like the automotive industry. So I think there's a book I read called The Blue Ocean Strategy, which is really relevant to this, what we're talking about today. And it uses the metaphor of, first of all, you've got a red ocean industry where the companies are always trying to outperform rivals because it's so competitive with a small amount of demand. Everyone's fighting over the same piece, and because of that, no one's adding value, no one's innovating or investing in anything new. But then you got the blue ocean, which is the untapped market space, which is all the unknowns that are out there today. And the way to actually get out into the blue ocean is to make sure you've got independent thinking and being a bit contrarian when you have to. So I think for every student, when you enter a design firm, you do need to do your own, your daily tasks, what you might have to do like an architect, but also being not afraid to actually do something a little bit different, because I think that's one of the scary things to do. But I think from the way an individual can contribute is actually looking to innovate and do things a little bit differently compared to what the old way of doing things is. So I think that, but also tinkerers, like on the weekend, not being afraid to go out and just try something new and just do free work. It might be working on some kind of program or something, or your own paper, or I used to volunteer with Beyond Zero Emissions, just a new thing. So just getting to the cutting edge as fast as you can. And then I think the individual contributor is just as important, as well as the other side of the dichotomy, which would be the regulator. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
The second part of the question.
Sorry?
The second part, my role. So my role specifically in developing the market for mid-rise timber construction. So there's always some kind of bottleneck. So 2 years ago, it might have been training up the engineers, and we built an engineering design guide, and it was cost estimators. And, right now it's probably training architects as well with timber first design thinking. So if you've got an old concrete building and then you say, oh, let's just make that a timber building, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole. You can't make it work. And then it really kills a timber project before you start. So I think training as many designers with the right design thinking from the start is the way I can assist with specifically on timber.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I totally agree. It has to be a collaborative there has to be a collaborative approach to making the change and shifting towards a circular approach and models. And Claire, would you like to add anything from your perspective, your perspective on the topic as an industry leader? Would you like to add anything to what Adam and Arianna said?
I do. I've got 2 points. One is that to follow up what Arianna said about transparency and not allowing people to game the system. I think one of the key things that needs to happen is a much better standard framework for how you're reporting on some of this information, particularly embodied carbon, life cycle carbon. There are just so many ways that you don't have to say all these parameters that you're bringing in to the calculation. And because of that, when I read something, because I know those parameters, I'm like, well, did they think of this? Did they think of that? Did they do this? I want to know more. And I think how we're reporting that information, unless that becomes more standardized and really transparent, the whole thing falls apart because people undermine it and they don't respect those numbers that they're seeing. So I think that's critical. Otherwise, its meaning, it becomes a little bit wishy-washy, and definitely want to avoid that. The other part around how to affect the change and who should be involved with that. And working in the health and wellbeing space in buildings over the last 5 years, there's been quite a fundamental shift in how we approach that on projects now, which has been spearheaded by the International Well Building Institute. So I do think there's a role, and the Green Building Council are the same, like they did it for green building in Australia probably more than 15 years ago now. But those tools become such a good framework for anyone in the project team to lean on if they find pushback from anyone else in the chain. So when you're dealing with a really long chain of suppliers and people all over the shop, I think that where those tools are extremely effective is reining it all in and being like, well, this is what we're doing, client wants that, we've got to deliver this, and it's set out, that's the end goal. And I feel like they've been very, like that they give that common metric for people to assess against. So you can't say, well, that one's like slightly circular, this one's a little bit more circular. Like it gives some more clarity to it. So there are some tools already that help us with circular economy and that they're established, and there's European standards around how to do life cycle assessment. But there's like in the UK, they've got the LETI framework, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, published a really good document on embodied carbon and how it should be looked at. And I think that would be so good to have for our industry here, and also like a bit more transparency around how you should be communicating that information.
Perfect.
And I guess we can help by doing that ourselves in our own job.
Yes, true. Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. Very interesting insights today. Donald, do you have any comments? Or otherwise, I can just have a look if there are any questions from the...
yes, there are a couple of questions that have come through, I think. I don't know if you want me to read them out or if you...
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
One from Sasha Alexander. Hi, Sasha. You're pointing out that Japan, they have some legislation, while buildings were designed, they were able to be dismantled, materials redeployed. So I think there's an interesting issue about where Australia is in terms of other countries more generally, and how far other countries have kind of legislated or not, and also whether that's been successful. I was reading a little bit about Spain bringing in quite some time ago, I think 15 or 20 years, a ruling that all construction waste had to be disaggregated in some form. This is an El País article in English I was reading, that a lot of it just was really prone to corruption. There wasn't enough watchdogs or safeguards or prosecutions to actually follow that through. So I mean, that's just in the waste field, and that's just in Spain. But obviously there are issues about how far, even with legislation in place, some of that can actually be enacted. I think that follows up Sean McKinnon's point as well, which is if you work backwards from end of life by legislating requirements for certain materials to be recycled, that could work backwards up the chain to drive change. So I think there's definitely something in that. I don't know what people on the panel think, but interesting comments.
The end of life is very difficult because I think a lot of people think that won't be my problem. And so how you are going to enforce that back through the chain to the very beginning is the challenge there. I don't know the answer, but to me that becomes something that I guess you have to think about it more than you do now, but how that would change things. It's an interesting way to go though, and I'm sure it would. I just don't know how. I don't know if other panelists have an idea about that. And where, you know, it really, who has to then make sure that that complies? Is it right at the beginning, the client is the one that sets the brief, says that the architects follow it through the whole way, how we would manage a process like that, or if there's anything equivalent now.
This is slightly related. I think one interesting indirect way of putting in the right direction would be mandating BIM like they've done in the UK, just so it touches on the point early, so you know exactly how much value is withheld in the building at the end for disassembly. Because if you don't, at the end of life, if you don't have all that information, then I think it's very unlikely that they're going to actually dismantle it properly. And you know, if you know how everything's connected, you can do it quite easily.
That'd be a great way to start that. I think that definitely would make it an easier job for anyone to know what they were getting into at disassembly.
Yeah. There is another interesting question. Andrew says the benefits of prefab and modular construction seem clear across all phases, from design and construction to maintenance and reuse at the end of life. So what do you think are the barriers to this becoming the norm? Why it's not the norm yet?
Oh, you go, Arianna.
I'm just thinking that, or if we think about like now the skyscraper or high-rise building, like with the curtain walls, that's already a certain degree of prefabrication, right? So what I think it's necessary to deep prefabrication becoming part of standard construction is really a cultural shift also in the way we conceive or the way we think or in the way we design the buildings, because I feel that in the sector now, the person or the actors that are more against prefabrication are architects. Part of that is because prefabrication has this kind of stigma that is about, you know, a building that is prefabricated is, or they are all the same. You can't really have a certain degree of flexibility with that. And that is coming from probably the first prefabrication experiments in the 70s with the concrete building and the cellular block. And the market since then and the framework, the context completely changed. So I think that there's a necessity also to reassess what we know and what we think about prefabrication in the sector, and in the perspective of all the new knowledge that we have now and the new technology as well, because clearly what was available in the 70s is not what is available now, right? So there is this cultural shift that should happen to really prefabrication be broadly diffused in the market.
Yeah, I just totally agree with what Arianna was saying. It's finding that way to maintain architectural flexibility, but with the benefits of prefabrication. And I think there's people working in that space, but no one's nailed it yet. And I think at the moment it's just like changing facade systems, but at the end of the day, it's all looking pretty boxy. So, you know, the endpoint or the paradigm should be a bit like putting Lego together. So you do get enough flexibility, but it's not quite a Lego building a Lego.
The Lego masters.
Yeah, that's right.
But can I just also say that, and this is more like a provocation probably, but like, do we really need, I don't want to say do we really need buildings to not look similar one to the other, but do we really need all the same high degree of flexibility for all the buildings, or can we, you know, negotiate for some buildings a higher level of prefabrication and maybe also higher level of sustainability compared to others where you need instead high flexibility? And I'm thinking about, you know, this kind of landmarks where you need something that is unique. And that's something that I just wanted to put it out there because it's something that we should also think about. We need to provide the right solution in the right place, in the right moment. So it's not always black or white. It could be a different degree of you know, prefabrication and different for different.
Yeah, and architectural flexibility. Yeah, I totally agree with this, because we have this approach where in every building, from one building to the other, we start all over again from the very beginning to design part by part. But if you think about it, like most of the buildings that comprises our built environment, they are very similar. They at least use the same materials and technologies. So surely we can cut on process inefficiency, design inefficiency, and surely we can, you know, optimize and prefabricate more, and perhaps have a more industrialized approach, while keeping a certain level of flexibility.
I think,
yeah,
sorry, but to say that, you know, we have a lot of fit outs where we know fit out and retail, the highest churners with materials that are really like they're no wear and tear and they're being taken out of buildings. And so, you know, would you do that if you, in the first place, had the building with beautiful timber floors? Would you keep wanting to, you know, replace carpet every 4 years? Or I think we've got to start thinking more long term, and it is cultural change, like you were both saying, that this expectation that it's got to be new all the time and that the old isn't as beautiful. Like you go into some heritage spaces now and there's features in there you don't see and that are all the more beautiful because they've been retained. And so I think we can try and wrap more of that sort of thinking into initial design, and design so it isn't there to just be like a cold shell space that is totally refitted every 5 to 10 years. And that's sort of in the commercial retail sector that happens more. But that's one of the most astonishing things to me in construction space, that we will go into space, I think this looks brand new, why is it getting refitted?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I was very interested. Many of you will have seen the op-ed piece that Dominic Perrottet, the New South Wales Treasurer, wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald about a week ago about the buildings in Sydney that he'd like to see demolished. And it was partly tongue-in-cheek, but of course it brought home the fact that when you're thinking about, you know, he's one of obviously the key public policy advocates in New South Wales, that the discussion was only at that level of demolition and aesthetics and so on, and nothing about how, you know, buildings actually have a heart and soul, I suppose, which, you know, look at that building, it may look ugly, but it runs like a dream, you know. So I think there's a bit of a shift in the discourse required around architecture itself that's not just about aesthetics. It's also about, you know, use and long-term longevity and comfort in long-term use and so on. There is one more question or comment coming through from Ashish Swarup. Adam Wells said about blue ocean strategy. My question is, how can Australian manufacturing companies exploring blue oceans and innovating sustainable products make themselves more visible to the industry and compete with overseas imports, such as Megaflow Green, Australian recycled plastic bottles, milk bottles, and so on? Any thoughts? So there's a general issue, I think, about, you know, the startup economy, the innovation economy, and how far small players can begin to make a difference, I think.
Yeah, I think small players have got the benefit of actually having a bit more speed, and they can move much quicker with, you know, the small experiments and the small little trials of new ways of doing things. So I don't know what supplier the person who asked the questions from, but if you're competing with overseas, then it is, you know, providing more value than them in any way you possibly can. And like, if I look at it for a timber supply point of view, which I know a bit more about, I think one offer might be a kit of parts, actually, you know, a standard 9x9 grid or a 9x6 meter grid package that you're selling, that gives cost certainty to builders and developers, because they don't know. That's one of the biggest problems they've got at the moment, is not having cost certainty. They're a bit worried that it's not going to get supplied, things are going to blow out, there's going to be variations, let's just stick to the way we've always done it. So I think that finding out what they want to get, or the biggest pain point is, and then solving it better than the overseas guys as much as you can.
Thank you. Perfect, Adam. Perhaps I'm aware of time. I have I have a question, like one last question, probably about the time frame. So we talk about, you know, like the shift, the change of the construction sector towards a more circular approach. So building circularity, so my question, I would be interesting to know your view on that. As what would you think would be a reasonable time frame for this shift to happen, and perhaps will we ever be able to talk about nearly zero waste buildings? I don't know if you have, yeah.
Yeah, I'm an optimist again with all this. I think things are moving extremely fast. Over the period of 1 year, it seems to be going slow, but over the period of 5 years, it's unbelievable the pace of change. So, you know, after renewable energy's solved, because that's being solved at a pretty fast rate, the spotlight is going towards materials more and more and more, and it is right now at a really unprecedented level. So as long as the spotlight's here, there's going to be more conferences like this one, more students, you know, focusing on this area with their research. And then by 2030, I think, I'd say would be near zero waste as long as we're in a prefabricated kind of environment for buildings. There's no reason why we need any waste.
I absolutely agree. I think things move far more rapidly than we expect sometimes. We started a job earlier this year, the Atlassian project with 50% embodied carbon reduction, with 2 sustainability managers that knew how to talk about that. And now we've got a team of 25 people talking about kilograms of carbon saved, or, you know, what we're going to gain, or the whole balance sheet is something that everyone who had no idea about it is now talking about, like, on an everyday basis. So, and the same with waste. It becomes something that we have to do, we do it. So I think clients shouldn't be afraid to set targets, shouldn't be afraid to ask builders to do them. I think mostly the teams around construction will rise to the challenge, and especially when there's possibility to do it, like zero waste. Well, there's probably a lot of things that we do now that are good, but that we could push it harder. It's become like quite business as usual to get a 95% reduction from landfill on a site. So if we have to do more, I think there's capacity to push the industry harder.
And I think that 2020, with everything that happened, so the bushfire before and the pandemic after, it could give also a sort of extra push to for an extra effort to the market, because it completely changed the environment where we design and we build. So it could really, let's say, create space for this extra effort, like extra general effort from everybody to achieve a different future. So as Adam said, I'm also an optimistic. So let's try to look things in perspective and hope for that.
Thank you so much. We don't have time, unfortunately, for another question. So this is the end of this session. I would like to wrap up thanking you all, like, again, thank you to the speakers, panelists, to your time. And this conversation has been great to me, very insightful. So I have a lot to think about, and over Christmas, perhaps. and so, yeah, thank you again. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you, Donald, as well, for the overview. And I will now end this session.